So for today, we follow suit, and we're gonna have, as we get close to the release of the season, a tier list when it comes to Mythic Plus. We looked at the Sims yesterday, which are closer to being more relevant overall for single target, therefore for the raid. For Mythic Plus, this is not the be-all, end-all of the power. It definitely can point to some powers of the specs, but they are not definitive of the power of a spec in Mythic Plus. So we're gonna go over and figure out which specs we believe are going to be very powerful in Mythic Plus, so that in a few weeks into the season we can go back and check just how correct this prediction was. So, talking about prediction, let's get rid of the bottom row very quickly with Windwalker, Destruction, and Shadow Priest. Now, the problem of these three specs, Destruction as well as Shadow Priest as well as Windwalker, is basically the same. It's not just in single target that they have a problem. The Sims here for these specs are amongst the lowest of all specs. This continues in AoE as well. That's just as simple as it is. The tier set powers of all these three specs are also not special whatsoever. Destro is a literal DPS loss, you have Windwalker, which is a literal DPS loss, and Shadow Priest, while not being a DPS loss compared to the Raberus tier set, has been nerfed, according to my sources, 76 times since the original version of the tier set. Then you add the nerf to Power Infusion, the nerf to Mass Dispel, the nerf to Mind Soothe, and then a bit of a spoiler, since today we're only gonna go through the DPS specs, it is very likely that a certain other priest spec is going to be a meta pick in the season, meaning you have even less of a reason to be bringing a priest anyways with Shadow. So all these three specs suffer from the same issue. They have very low single target and their AoE damage is mediocre. So overall, they end up being just not a very promising choice in Mythic Plus. The next batch of specs down the C tier, we have Frost Decay, we have Affliction, we have Elemental, as well as Arms Warrior, as soon as I find it here, and lastly Devastation Evoker. Now, some of these specs are here for different reasons. The main concern, for example, for Devastation is that while their single target damage, for example, is quite middling to average, they have a bigger problem. The bigger problem is that Augmentation is going to be very likely, spoilers ahead, an S tier spec, meaning the value of a second evoker goes down a lot in a Mythic Plus key because you're going to be doubling up on the possible utility, for example, brought in a key. They still have their own weakness as well, the fact that they are even more with the tier set given to Devastation in season 3. They are even more reliant on the tier set that they gain in season 3, the power of this tier set right here that buffs Dragon Rage even more, which is good in the raid for damage windows, but not as strong in Mythic Plus, where you are even weaker when you don't have Dragon Rage. Affliction has a different kind of problem. This problem is similar to the three specs at the bottom. The problem of Affliction is that its tier set is significantly buffing their single target. But in AoE you are mostly going to run around with Seed of Corruption, which is not really working well with the power of your tier set. On top of that, the power of your tier set is mediocre as well. So even with the power of your tier set, it's not that you become a powerhouse in single target. Actually, you're still quite weak, and you're still not that strong in AoE. The same concept can be applied to Arms and Frost Decay, not nearly as bad, because both Arms and Frost are, again, quite average in damage, together with Devastation in terms of single target, and similarly, the power of their tier sets is very low. It's barely a 0.5% gain for Arms and a 3% or so gain for Frost Decay, so they're not gaining that big of a boost in terms of tier set damage. Arms really has got this problem that they were never that powerful in AoE. They have gotten their Ignore Pain part of the rotation completely removed in 10.3 without being given something in return. That's the biggest problem for Arms, who is now going to be overflowing with Rage without having proper ways to spend it. Already in single target, but even worse now in AoE, and therefore in Mythic Plus. Frost Decay's problem is the lack of damage, just sustained damage overall, plus doing less damage than another spec in their class. unholy. That's a big problem. And then Elemental. Elemental is the first of our specs who doesn't deserve, to be honest, doesn't deserve to be here. Elemental is doing top single target damage. And on top of that, their tier set, Elemental, used to be super powerful, but now has been nerfed multiple times, down to not being that big of a gain compared to Aberus tier set. And the result is their damage now is okay, but they remain one of the squishiest specs in the game in terms of DPS. They also remain as an elemental spec, someone that doesn't give you basically anything special in your party, no special party or raid buff compared to basically any other spec in the game. Overall, while they have the highest damage across all of these, the lack of everything else of Elemental Shaman is what drags them down into this tier of performance. In the middle of the pack, as per the definition itself, we have our biggest clump of specs, because we start with Fury Warrior, then we have Subtlety, we also have Ret, we also have Frost Mage, we have Marksmanship, Hunter, we have Demo, Warlock, and lastly we have Unholy DK. Now, some of these specs are here due to being kind of unlucky. Let's start with the number one unlucky spec, which is Sub. So, Subtlety, as per the log themselves, they have one of the strongest, if not the strongest tier set. On top of that, they do pretty well with a few other buffs as a sub-spec, like for example Wind Fury. They are the best spec for Wind Fury. On top of that, their Sims sub is one of the best. So, great times for sub. Well, not nearly as much, because number one, they are still below Outlaw, which is already a problem when you have to choose a rogue spec in your group. Many will opt for the Outlaw pick. And the negatives of Subtlety are not even that present, because, for example, many of their negatives would also be negatives for Assassination and would also be negatives for Outlaw. When it comes to utility, crowd control, defensiveness, many of them are gonna be one and the same after, as you know, the specs are getting reworked in this major patch. The only problem for them is that the other two specs of Rogue at the moment seem to be doing better. That's just why Subtlety is right here. No real other reason. It's a similar situation than Devastation, except they are doing even better than them. The problem for Retribution is a bit more depressing, because while they're not doing that well in single target, and while the power of their tier set is not particularly powerful, they still have gotten a very powerful tier set, particularly in AoE, more so than single target. There is a problem though. To be able to spec yourself, let's just call it like this, spec yourself so much in Mythic Plus compared to the raid, you have to change quite a lot in terms of power, going even lower down in single target. You are in one of those unfortunate situations where you have to significantly weaken your single target damage, even more so, to be able to do AoE. It's always sad. I'm sure you've all been through it as a DPS spec, when you have to choose whether or not you want to be doing competitive AoE damage at the cost of doing tank single target, or the other way around. Ret is in one of these positions, which many other specs don't have to choose. Many other specs above Ret will be able to do very good single target while also doing top AoE damage, for example. That's one of the weaknesses of Ret right now. Talking about weaknesses, then we have Frost Mage, who is a brother in arms with Subtlety because it suffers from the same issues. Frost is doing actually very high damage compared to, for example, the specs at the bottom, where their weakness is the low damage. For Frost, the damage part is a-okay. The problem is they are part of a class with two other specs that also do DPS, and at the moment these other two DPS specs are doing more than Frost Mage. It's just that simple. What is perhaps even simpler is Marksmanship. So Marksmanship we have memed on the spec multiple times when looking at the logs, when looking at the PTR results, because Marksmanship was terrible, really bad. Then they have been massively bailed out in one of the recent PTR changes, who gave them a new tier set. This tier set right here bailed them out from mediocrity. As you can see, 9% DPS gain is amongst the highest across all specs, so even though after this 9% DPS gain, their damage is still shit in single target, and when it comes to AoE, they are still somewhat target capped compared to other specs. Their damage is not nearly as high as it could, but if I were a marksmanship hunter, considering your outlook of the patch until 2 weeks ago was not even here, like it wasn't there, your outlook on the patch was not even existing, and now you find yourself to be average. So I think it's a win overall. You're still weaker than BM and you're weaker than even survival, but you are still much stronger than you were supposed to be before the release of this patch. There are a couple of other specs left in here, like Fury and Unholy and even Demo. Most of the problems of these specs are similar. The problem of Fury is just the overall damage, and they're not too great utility. You might be bailed out if this ends up being a melee season where, for example, Outlaw and Havoc for maybe our meta. Bringing a warrior with Battle Shout might buff the melee group even more. That might be a way out, but their biggest issue right now is their damage not being nearly as competitive. Same can be said for Demo. The fact that they have been changed approximately 77 times in 10.3, receiving multiple iterations of what Blizzard wanted to do with all of their demon pet damage, which changed a while throughout the PTR. Even in their current final version, their damage is just too low to be super competitive. And the same can be said for Unholy, who received a very similar treatment to Demo. They were the ones who have gotten their top burst damage nerfed in exchange for having more consistent single target and even more importantly AoE damage buffed. Big cooldowns like Army of the Dead having its damage reduced, as well as Summon Gargoyle having its damage reduced, but in return most of your other standard abilities being buffed. This gives you more straightforward and smooth damage, but it doesn't work out in Mythic Plus. Your overall damage in Mythic Plus is still on average too low to be considered one of the top specs. I guess your only win is that you're still overall doing slightly better than your competitor in your same class in Frost DK. The last of the packs of groups end up being the A tier, which is also going to have a lot of specs with, chances to do well. It's basically pretty much many of the remaining specs. Now, a lot of these specs could have their description on what they do well and what they do not, but at this point we have basically pointed out already that the majority of these specs' main problem is not being able to do as much damage as some of the other more meta ones, like for example Enhancement or for example Survival, or even more so specs like Fire and Arcane out-damaging their counterparts. Fire and Arcane have the same utility as Frost, but they out-damage it. You have Survival and BM out-damaging marksmanship. You also have specs like Enhancement out-damaging melee specs like Unholy and Fury, for example. Some of the perhaps more interesting in here are Feral and Assassination. These two specs were historically known as being slow scaling, slow ramping dot-based specs, so in the end, in Mythic Plus, they always ended up never actually mattering because packs died too quickly for them to actually do their damage, blah blah blah. Now they have been improved on multiple fronts. The Feral Druid tier set is extremely good in Mythic Plus in giving you your burst damage nowadays tied to Feral Frenzy, so that you have an on-demand burst cooldown for Mythic Plus keys, for Mythic Plus packs, which is very good for the spec. Assassination, I guess at this point we can say it's one of the beneficiaries of the rework, because much like the other rogue spec, it has become a much stronger spec, even in their biggest weakness, which was Mythic Plus, which was AoE damage. This is unarguably the strongest version of Assassination in Mythic Plus they have ever been in. As a whole, as a spec. Even if you actually don't have that much of an interest in the spec, you might even try it just to see how it feels like to not be shit in Mythic Plus as an Assassination spec. Plenty of tool reworked and redesigned or added completely in Mythic Plus, like Indiscriminate Carnage. that now is a passive, so it's not even an ability that you have to use on a cooldown. It's always active. When you come from stealth, you have Sanguine Blades, the new energy draining tool to be doing even more damage in AoE. Caustic Spatter, your splash damage, basically, as pointed out here, the shittier version of Blade Flurry, who is still strong, is giving you way more AoE damage than before, as Assassination, for example. A few other specs are here, but you're not too surprised, like Enhancement, as we pointed out, like Fire Mage, even BM has been doing progressively better over time, Balanced Druid as well. These are not nearly as surprising. Perhaps the one that is more surprising is Arcane Mage, who is not your default popular spec in Mythic Plus most of the time. However, the skill level, the skill ceiling of being able to properly use Arcane is much harder. You are likely going to hate Arcane Mages in Pugs. Your idea of an Arcane Mage is likely going to be around here for the majority of Pug players. Good Arcane Mage players can stay here, but it's a much harder tier list rank to keep as Arcane compared to a Fire Mage, or compared even to a BM Hunter or a Balanced Druid. The ease of execution of an Arcane Mage in Mythic Plus, even more so, is much harder to pull off as a spec. That's the disclaimer for thinking Arcane is going to be doing well in Mythic Plus in this upcoming season. This shouldn't leave too many surprises about the top 3 of the Mythic Plus season. We have talked about Outlaw and we have talked about Havoc for a long time. Even in the Sims in single target, inexplicably, you have Outlaw as the strongest simming single target spec. Havoc is in the top 10 and still doing plenty fine. Even in terms of tier set power, funnily enough, Outlaw is so OP, they basically didn't even need a tier set to be stronger. They are just being buffed from the rework to be that much stronger. They didn't need a stronger tier set. Havoc got both. Havoc got the rework and got one of the strongest tier sets in the game. The results is just too much damage. There isn't really much to talk about. It's not that Outlaw does something special compared to Subtlety or Assassination. They just do more damage. Crackshot is OP. Underhanded Upper Hand is one of the most broken talents I've ever seen being added into the game and not being nerfed. And the current state of Outlaw is just too strong. Havoc is on a similar note. After the rework, they have just been doing top level, top tier damage overall consistently throughout all of the PTR. But that's not all. The rework gave them tons more ways to survive. Now you have an easy path to take Netherwalk, so now you also have an immunity in your Mythic Plus group. You have way more defensiveness than before compared to your previous build. It's just all stronger. You have way more defensiveness than before. Your sigils have gotten stronger by the changes to the general tree and now your baseline spells. So overall, you have gotten stronger in damage, you've gotten stronger in defensiveness, you've gotten stronger in utility. So yet another case of what we predicted, by the way, I'm calling this right now, what we predicted about Blizzard making a rework spec suddenly become OP. And now we have the same thing in 10.3 with all of the rogue specs and all of the Demon Hunter specs at the moment doing extremely well. I don't want to spend too much time talking about augmentation because there isn't really much to talk about. First, it's already basically impossible to properly sim Augmentation Evoker. There isn't really much to say anyways about the change to their tier set. The extra use of Prescience is not even as important in Mythic Plus. It's way more value in the raid anyways, but it's just, you know, the utility and the defensiveness of a support spec is proving to be too OP in Mythic Plus and continues to be too OP in Mythic Plus even after the 17 plus 4 divided by 3 multiplied by 7, even after the 79.4 nerfs given to augmentation since its release, they are still proving to be too hard of a spec to balance in Mythic Plus. So this is what we can expect as a prediction when it comes to the meta of Mythic Plus as soon as the patch comes out. We will see exactly how these slots will come into place. Perhaps it's gonna be a full melee comp, but then augmentation is out. So augmentation will be in with Havoc. And then what about the other spec? Is it gonna be Outlaw? What if the tank is gonna be Vengeance? Are we gonna run double Demon Hunter? If we run Vengeance, are we gonna drop the Demon Hunter to pick up maybe Enhancement? maybe a second ranged with balance. Wait, if we pick balance and the meta healer is Discipline Priest, are we going into a group with 2 fewer interrupts? Maybe not. We will see what kind of matches and blocks put together will form when it comes to the meta group in Mythic Plus. But for today at least, this is the supposed prediction when it comes up to the meta of Mythic Plus for DPS. Likely tomorrow, we will move over to the prediction when it comes to tanks and when it comes to healers. Hoping, of course, that it will be a slightly shorter video than what we managed to do for today. So, with this out of the way on this Friday, it's time to leave each other once more. We're starting the goodbyes by thanking all of the Patreon supporters for the contribution and the help to the growth of the channel, which can, as usual, still be given completely for free. You can like and comment down below, as well as subscribe to the channel itself. Now, with these things out of the way, thank you guys again for watching. See you guys tomorrow, and in the meantime, I hope that assassination becomes a thing in Season 3. I'm actually biased for a DPS spec. It's been a meme and weak for so long, I actually want to see it be powerful for once.